Grace, mercy, and peace to you from God our Father and our Lord Jesus the Christ. There was a farmer, well, I should probably give you a little bit more background. When I was growing up, one of my favorite things was to turn on the microphone. My parents always thought I wasn't speaking loud enough. Can you believe that? No. Okay, let's start that again. When I was growing up, I loved reading the Grimm fairy tales. The book that I had, I still have, and it's in pieces. But the fairy tales were very exciting and enjoyable. And one of my favorite fairy tales from the Grimm brothers was a fairy tale about a farmer. And he was a special kind of farmer. He was very wise, and he seemed to know an awful lot about farming. And on one occasion, God was walking the earth, and he came upon this farmer, and he said, how are you doing? And the farmer said, well, you know, I'm doing rather well. And he said, how are you doing? And God said, well, I'm doing well. And the farmer said, you know, he said, I do have a concern. Do you mind if I share it with you? And God said, no, go right ahead. And so the farmer said, you know, the way you've created the world, especially wheat, he said, it's really not very economical. He said, the wheat has a stalk about 2 or 3 feet high. At the top there's a head with the kernels in it. He said, you know, he said, I think I could do a better job. He said, would you give me the power next year to make the wheat the way I think it ought to grow? And God said, well, I guess we can do that. And so the farmer decided that he was going to have not just one head at the top of this 2 or 3 foot stalk, but he would actually have all the way down the stalk. He would have heads for kernels of wheat. And it was amazing because the plant just grew, and the right sunshine, the right rain, and the harvest time came, and they harvested, and there was nothing. And God came back, and the man said, I don't understand it. He said, I was sure, I had figured it out, I did all the right things. And God said, well, how about the wind? He said, well, I didn't want the wind because in the past my crops were often destroyed by the wind. He said, so I decided not to have the wind. And God said, but without the wind, there is no pollinization. And the farmer looked, and he recognized what I think you and I need to recognize when we speak with God, is that our wisdom really doesn't measure up. We are told in this section of Job, in the 28th chapter, which I'd like to begin with today, we are told, but where shall wisdom be found, and where is the place of understanding? And the writer of Job continues with that same theme, asking the question, where? Now we're reading the 23rd verse. From where then does wisdom come, and where is the place of understanding? And then he makes a positive statement. God understands the way to it, and he knows its place, for he looks to the ends of the earth, and he sees everything under the heavens. When he gave to the wind its weight, and apportioned the waters by measure, when he made a decree from the rain, and a way for the lightning of the thunder, then he saw it and detached it, he established it and searched it out, and he said to man, behold, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. It's incredibly important for us to recognize that regardless of all the knowledge that we have attained either through academic pursuits or experiences that we've had, regardless of the amount of knowledge, even regardless of the wisdom, it can't match the wisdom of God. And we need to understand, in order to understand the whole perspective of Job on suffering, we need to understand that one of the underlying assumptions, no, not assumptions, assertions in the book of Job is that God is wise and no one else. And human wisdom is only possible when we fear the Lord. And so I'd like to emphasize that again. Last week we talked about the fact that we all have suffering and that we need to learn how to trust. And one of the reasons we can trust God is because he indeed is wise. He indeed does know. His wisdom has no end. His ways are different than our ways. And until we grasp that, until we really internalize it and make it our own and start acting that way and not act as if, well, we can solve these problems by ourselves. When we acknowledge our dependence because of His trustworthiness and His wisdom, then we are fearing the Lord. And that's the beginning of wisdom and understanding. So that's the first thing that we want to look at or have looked at today, and that is if God is trustworthy, He can be trustworthy, and one of the reasons He's trustworthy is that He is all-knowing and that He is wise. But there's more here. Because if you are honest with yourselves, and I'm not excluding myself when I say that, when we're honest with ourselves, we have all played the role of Job at one time or another and challenged God to explain what He was doing. We talked a little bit about that last Sunday and last week. We have the penchant, we have the desire, we have the audacity, we have the visceral reaction to God that almost invariably leads us down the path where we say to God, God, explain yourself, tell us what is going on. Okay, I'll accept it, but at least you explain yourself. And God's silent. He's been silent for 32 chapters. He's silent. He doesn't respond. When I was first practicing law in the late 1970s and early 1980s, there was a guru in the legal community by the name of Irving Younger. Irving Younger was a professor at Columbia Law School. He had been a federal prosecutor, he'd been in private practice, he'd been a judge, and he was lecturing in various places. And his favorite lecture was on the 10 Commandments to cross-examination. And any lawyer who does trial work knows that the hardest skill to develop is the skill of cross-examination. And on one occasion, in order to illustrate a point, Irving Younger said during his lecture, he said, he said, when I die, I'm going to go to heaven, and I'm going to confront God, and I'm going to cross-examine Him the way He has never been cross-examined. He owes me an explanation of so many things, and I'm going to insist that He give me an answer. Not too long after that, he developed pancreatic cancer. In 1988, he died. He was a wonderful man, a terrific professor, an incredible legal mind. But even he did not have the right to cross-examine God, and nor do we. And yet we do it. Yet we do it with an audacity that sometimes frightens me and myself. And one of the reasons we will get nowhere with God is because He is sovereign and He is in control. And now we can turn to the passage that David read just a few moments ago in the 38th chapter. Who is it, Jesus? This is God. God is finally talking. 30-some chapters, He's finally talking. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? He's referring to Job. Thus dress for action. Like a man, I will question you, and you make it known to me. You see, the opposite of questioning God is for us to acknowledge that He questions us. It is God who places our life into question and provides the only answer to that question. And so here, God is saying to Job, hey look, He said, you asked the question why. I have some questions for you. In fact, he goes on and he has 70 questions, 70 to 1. Job is asking why, and God has 70 questions for him. Questions which deal with the creation. Let me just give you a sampling of the questions. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Who determined its measurements? And interestingly enough, why don't you try to respond to these questions as if God were asking you or us those questions? Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Who determined its measurements? On what were its bases sunk? Oh, who shut in the sea with the doors when it burst out from the womb, when I made clouds its garments and thick darkness, and prescribed limits for it? Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of. It is charged, it's changed like clay under the seal. And he goes on and on and on, and asks 70 questions about creation and about nature. And the reality is that Job is unable to answer any of those questions. And even though we might fool ourselves into thinking, well, since then we've made a lot of progress, and science has provided an enormous number of answers, so that the number of questions that God would have for us would have to be smaller, because we have become so much more intelligent, knowledgeable, and wise. But the reality is that we have never found answers to the question why. There isn't a single scientist who's been able to answer the question, why were we created? Why were we saved? The why question is a question that science can't answer, except in terms of determining the etiology, determining the cause. They may try to get some kind of an idea as to what caused the event, but not why that happened. And it's important for us to recognize the sovereignty of God. And that's the point that God is making with Job. I am the sovereign. You don't ask me questions. I ask you questions. You don't put me on trial, I put you on trial. Of course, when we get to Easter, we'll find a different answer. But here is the point again. It's important for us to recognize that we have a God who is so powerful and so mighty and so sovereign that we can trust Him, we can rely on Him to deal with our issues and our concerns and even our suffering. Without that kind of God, we would be lost in the suffering that each of us and all of us at one time or another would probably go through. And so he talks about nature, and he talks about one thing else, and that is the might and power. In other words, God is saying beginning in chapter 40, he's saying, have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like mine? And then he goes on to say, hey, I got two examples for you, God is saying. The first one is a behemoth. That word has even come into our language. A behemoth is a huge, huge creature, or huge, huge problem. And so God is saying, there is this behemoth. I don't think there's anybody or any animal or any creature on earth that is stronger than this behemoth. We don't know whether Job is referring to an actual, or the book is referring to an actual animal, or whether it is referring to a symbol. We don't know. But we do know that in the book of Job, it is viewed as an incredibly strong animal creature. And God is saying, if you're so tough, he said, let me see you tame it. Let me see you tame it. And of course, Job has no answer. And then God says, there isn't just a behemoth, there's also a Leviathan. Leviathan was a sea creature. And again, I don't know whether the Loch Ness Monster would qualify for it. Who knows? But we do know that it's a sea creature. And here is God's question for Job. He said, can you draw out Leviathan with a fisher? And later on he says, can you make sort of a little pet out of him? And of course the answer is Job can't. And he confronts his own limitations. But in the process of doing so, he recognizes the incredible, limitless power that God has. And that's the second reason. First, because he is wise. Second of all, because he is sovereign and has mighty power that we can trust him. So, how are we going to respond? Well, let me refer to an incident that supposedly happened in the 1990s. I've been trying to search for it, and I get different kind of reports. There are some admirals who say, yes, it happened. There are other admirals who say, no, it hasn't. So I'll let you make up your own mind. In this particular time period, in the early 1990s, there was an aircraft carrier, USS Abraham Lincoln, and it was going through exercises in the northern part of the Atlantic, close to Nova Scotia. And on one very, very, very foggy day, when the signalman barely could see a light in the distance, called the captain and he said, there's a light that is signaling us that we should divert 15 degrees south. The captain sort of, he says, I'm the captain of the ship. He says, signal back. He says, you divert 15 degrees north. And so the signalman did that, and the message came back, repeat, divert 15 degrees south. And the captain was angry, and he said, go and tell him that Captain Smith said, divert. It's about time they divert 15 degrees north. So the signalman did, and the message came back. No, he said, this is Seaman second class. Divert 15 degrees south. And now the captain went up to the bridge himself, and he said, tell him that this is a carrier, an aircraft carrier that has 3 destroyers and 3 other ships, battleships, as well as various other support ships. So they went up, and the message was signaled, divert 15 degrees north. This is an aircraft carrier. And the message came back, divert 15 degrees south. This is a lighthouse. It's your call. What would you do? God is our lighthouse. God is our lighthouse. And next week we'll look how Job responds to the lighthouse in our lives.